In the basement of a museum in Atlanta, Georgia, behind a vault door rated to withstand fire, flood, and forced entry, sits a chest freezer. Not a large one. About the size you might keep in a garage for extra meat. Two of them exist in the entire world. The other is in a closed city in Siberia, behind a similar door, behind similar guards. Inside each freezer are a few hundred sealed vials, kept at -70 degrees Celsius, watched 24 hours a day by people with the authority to shoot if anyone tries to remove them without permission. What is inside those vials has not infected a single human being since 1977. And yet, two governments that have agreed on almost nothing else for the last 50 years have agreed completely on one thing. This is the one thing on Earth that is too dangerous to destroy and too dangerous to keep. Inside those vials is a virus with no name that means anything to most people anymore. Variola. You know it by an older name, smallpox. And the reason two superpowers keep a few hundred vials of a disease they have already defeated locked behind blast doors is the same reason you are about to spend the next 20 minutes with me. For roughly 3,000 years, this virus did something no human empire, no army, and no king ever fully managed. It decided who got to rule the world. And then, within a single human lifetime, we beat it so completely that the only place it still exists is in two freezers, waiting for permission nobody intends to give. To understand how a thing too small to see ended up deciding the fate of kings, you have to go back to a body that has been dead for over 3,000 years. In 1898, archaeologists unwrapping the mummy of an Egyptian pharaoh named Ramses V found something strange on his preserved skin. Raised, pitted scars clustered across his face and limbs. In a pattern doctors recognized instantly the moment photographs of the mummy reached them. It was a smallpox rash, fossilized in linen and resin for 3,000 years. Ramses V had died of smallpox around 1145 BCE, making him, as far as we can tell, the oldest confirmed victim of the disease whose actual body still exists for us to examine. But here is the part that should unsettle you. He was not patient zero. Geneticists who have spent decades tracing the virus's family tree backward through time believe it had already been quietly moving through human populations for thousands of years before Ramses ever wore a crown, jumping into us from some rodent ancestor in northeastern Africa, long before anyone wrote anything down. It found us right around the same time we did something that, at the time, felt like nothing but progress. We stopped wandering. We started building walls and storing grain and living, for the first time in the history of our species, in actual crowds. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Smallpox is brutally, almost unfairly contagious, spreading through the air and through touch, fast enough that one infected person walking through a market could leave the disease behind in dozens of strangers before he ever felt the first symptom himself. A handful of nomadic families scattered across open land could not sustain an outbreak like that. The virus would simply run out of people to infect and die out. But a city was exactly what it needed. Picture the first farmers building the first real towns along the Nile, the Tigris, the Indus, packing tighter and tighter together, sharing wells, sharing grain stores, sharing the open sewers running down the middle of the street. Without knowing it, without any way of knowing it, they were building the perfect machine for a disease that would not have a name for another 2,000 years. The disease itself worked like a slow, theatrical countdown. You could be infected and feel nothing at all for nearly 2 weeks. Then, almost overnight, the fever arrived, along with aching joints and vomiting, violent enough to leave you unable to stand. 2 or 3 days later came the part that gave the disease its name and its horror. A rash, starting inside the mouth and throat, spreading outward across the face, down the arms, across the torso, until eventually it covered the entire body in raised, fluid-filled pustules, packed so densely against each other that, in the worst cases, the skin looked less like skin and more like a single continuous wound. The pustules sat deep, deeper than an ordinary rash, which is why the ones who survived carried the pitted scarring for the rest of their lives. Roughly 3 in every 10 people who caught it died from it. Among people meeting the virus for the very first time in their lives, with no inherited resistance at all, the death toll could climb past 5 in 10. And surviving was its own kind of sentence. Many were left blind. Almost all were left scarred, so thoroughly and so commonly that for long stretches of human history, unmarked, unscarred skin was the unusual thing to see on a person's face, not the rash. For most of ancient history, that was simply how it worked. The disease swept through a city, killed a third of it, scarred the rest, and receded, only to return again a generation later when enough new, unexposed children had been born to give it fresh ground to burn through. Nobody had any way to fight back. And then, sometime around the 3rd century, somewhere in China, somebody noticed something that should not have been possible to notice without modern medicine, and changed the entire trajectory of the disease's relationship with our species. They noticed that the people who survived a mild case of smallpox never caught it again. Not weeks later, not years later, not ever. And from that single observation came an idea so unsettling, it is almost hard to picture someone actually trying it for the first time. If a mild case grants permanent protection, what happens if you deliberately give someone a mild case on purpose? They called it variolation, and by the time the practice reached the Ottoman Empire in the early 1700s, it had already been quietly used across parts of Asia and Africa for generations, passed along by ordinary healers, not court physicians. A doctor would take material from a patient with a mild case, sometimes ground scabs, sometimes pus drawn straight from a pustule, and introduce it into a healthy person through a small cut in the skin. Most who underwent it developed a mild, controlled version of the disease and emerged with lifelong immunity. Some did not. Somewhere between 1 and 2 in every 100 people variolated. This way died from the procedure itself. And in the days before they recovered, they were just as contagious as anyone with a natural case, capable of starting fresh outbreaks rather than stopping them. But set that risk against a disease that killed 3 in 10 people outright, and a 1 or 2% gamble started to look less like a risk and more like the best odds anyone had ever been offered. It reached Europe through one woman with a very personal reason to care. In 1717, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, the wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, stood and watched variolation performed in Constantinople. She had survived smallpox herself years earlier, a disease that had already killed her brother and left her own face permanently scarred, and she had her own young son inoculated there on the spot. When she returned to England, she spent years pushing the idea against a wall of ridicule, eventually convincing the royal family to test the procedure first on condemned prisoners, who were offered their freedom in exchange, and then, once it held, on royal children themselves. Variolation spread through the aristocracy of Europe over the following decades, and in doing so, it quietly turned survival into a luxury good. The poor caught smallpox in the ordinary way and either died or carried the scars for life. The rich paid a physician to infect them deliberately, under careful watch, and walked away protected. For most of the 1700s, your odds against the deadliest disease in the world were, quite literally, a function of your family's bank balance. That calculus broke in 1796 in a small English village called Berkeley, because a country doctor named Edward Jenner paid attention to something local farmers had been saying for years without anyone bothering to test it. Milkmaids who caught a much milder disease from cattle, called cowpox, never seemed to come down with smallpox afterward. On the 14th of May, 1796, Jenner took fluid from a cowpox sore on the hand of a milkmaid named Sarah Nelmes and used it to inoculate an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. The boy developed a small, localized blister, ran a mild fever for a day, and recovered completely within the week. Weeks later, in the part of the experiment that would never be allowed today, Jenner deliberately exposed Phipps to live smallpox. Nothing happened. The boy was immune. Jenner had not invented inoculation. People across Asia and the Ottoman Empire had been doing some version of it for longer than anyone in England had been alive. What Jenner had found was something genuinely new, a way to grant the same protection without ever putting the real disease into a person's body at all. He called it vaccination, from the Latin word for cow, and he spent years being mocked for it by parts of the medical establishment before the method quietly outran the ridicule and spread from Russia to the Americas. For the first time since smallpox had first found its way into a human body, the species it had been preying on had a real weapon to use back. While European doctors were still arguing about whether a milkmaid's blister could outwit one of the deadliest diseases on Earth, smallpox was already on a ship, crossing an ocean, about to do something no European army would ever come close to matching. When Spanish vessels reached the Caribbean and then the coast of Mexico in the early 1500s, they carried smallpox in the bodies of their crews into a hemisphere that had never once encountered it. The peoples of the Americas had been cut off from the disease pools of Europe, Asia, and Africa for over 10,000 years. Since the very first migrations across the Bering Land Bridge, which meant they carried no inherited resistance whatsoever, no folk memory of how to manage an outbreak. Nothing. The virus reached the Caribbean around 1518 and moved onto the mainland soon after, traveling ahead of the conquistadors themselves along indigenous trade routes faster than any Spanish soldier could march on foot. By November of 1519, when Hernán Cortés first rode into Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, he was looking at a city bigger than Paris, bigger than London, built on an island in the middle of a lake and connected to the mainland by causeways wide enough for 10 horses side by side. He had perhaps 500 men. The empire he was standing inside commanded armies in the tens of thousands. By any reasonable measure, he should have died there, and very nearly did, fleeing the city in 1520 after an uprising that very nearly wiped out his entire force. Within a year, he was governing the ashes of that same empire. Historians have argued for 5 centuries about how steel swords, horses no one in the Americas had ever seen before, alliances with rival peoples who despised Aztec rule. All 3 of those things are true, and none of them is the actual answer, because by the time Cortés returned to finish the conquest in 1521, smallpox had already torn through Tenochtitlan ahead of him. The Aztec emperor Cuitlahuac, who had taken the throne only after his predecessor's death, ruled for exactly 80 days before the disease killed him too, on the 3rd or 4th of December, 1520. Picture what that actually means inside a palace. Not one battle lost. The emperor, his generals, his administrators, and the farmers who fed the entire city, all dying within weeks of each other, faster than any government in human history has ever had to reorganize around a loss. The empire did not fall to Cortés's army. It collapsed from the inside before his army ever needed to fight for it. The same pattern played out a second time, on the opposite side of the continent, in a way that is almost too precise to be coincidence. In South America, the Inca Empire fractured into a civil war over succession, after its emperor, Huayna Capac, died of smallpox before a single Spanish soldier under Francisco Pizarro had even reached the Andes. The empire effectively wounded itself, fighting its own succession crisis, in the years before Pizarro arrived to exploit the wreckage. Across the hemisphere, In the century that followed first contact, historians estimate the total population collapse at somewhere between 60 and 90% in the hardest-hit regions, driven primarily by smallpox alongside measles, influenza, and typhus, all diseases the Old World had been quietly trading back and forth for thousands of years, and the New World had never met even once. Entire cities stood empty before a single conquistador ever marched into them. What makes this darker still is that the people doing the conquering eventually noticed exactly what kind of weapon had fallen into their hands, and some of them stopped treating it as an accident. In 1763, during a siege at Fort Pitt in North America, British officers facing a determined Native American force outside the walls deliberately handed over 2 blankets and a handkerchief taken directly from the fort's own smallpox hospital to emissaries negotiating under a flag of truce. The militia commander recorded the act in his own journal, writing that he hoped it would, in his words, have the desired effect. The British Army later approved payment to replace the very items that had been deliberately exposed to the disease and given away. Whether that specific act caused the outbreak that followed is still debated, since smallpox may already have been spreading through the besieging force before the blankets ever changed hands. But the intent behind it was never in question, and the pattern, deliberate or not, repeated itself across centuries of colonization on every continent the disease touched. Empires that had built road networks spanning thousands of miles and governed millions of people were reduced to a fraction of their population within a few generations, and the powers that replaced them inherited land that had, in every sense that mattered, already been cleared before a single flag was planted in the ground. Smallpox was not finished deciding power once the Americas had fallen quiet. It walked straight into the most heavily guarded palaces in Europe and did precisely what it had always done, with no regard whatsoever for crowns or bloodlines. In 1700, King Charles II of Spain died without an heir, the last of the Spanish Habsburg line, a line that smallpox had already been quietly narrowing for decades by killing off potential successors one by one. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, one of the largest conflicts Europe had seen, redrawing borders that had stood for generations. In 1711, Holy Roman Emperor Joseph I died of it, reshuffling the Habsburg succession a second time in the same decade. In Russia, 14-year-old Tsar Peter II died of it in 1730, plunging the court into a fresh crisis over who would rule next. England's Queen Mary II died of it in 1694, quietly shifting the balance of power between her and her husband for the rest of his reign. France's Louis XV had survived the disease once as a child, only for it to return decades later in 1774 and finish what it had failed to do the first time. No fortress wall stopped it. No army could be raised against it. It moved through a king's bedchamber with exactly the same ease it moved through the poorest house in the poorest village. And it did not care, even slightly, what was written on anyone's birth certificate. By the 1700s, smallpox was killing an estimated 400,000 people across Europe every single year, and was responsible for somewhere near a third of all blindness on the continent. For longer than most of the empires it touched managed to survive, it stood as one of the single most powerful forces on Earth, deciding who lived, who ruled, and who simply vanished from the historical record. And then, in less time than it takes most empires to rise, humanity did something no civilization had ever managed against any disease in the whole of recorded history. We erased it, completely. That erasure did not happen quickly, and it did not happen by accident. Vaccination campaigns spread unevenly through the 1700s and 1800s, slowed by skepticism, by the simple difficulty of manufacturing enough vaccine, and by trying to reach populations spread across entire continents long before anyone had refrigeration or modern transportation to keep a vaccine viable on the journey. It was not until 1967, when the World Health Organization launched what it called the Intensified Eradication Program, that the fight against smallpox became something the entire world was finally doing together. At that moment, the disease was still killing an estimated 2 million people a year, concentrated heavily in parts of Africa, Asia, and South America, with some of the least developed healthcare systems on the planet. Critics called the goal naive. No disease of this scale had ever been fully eliminated before, and the logistics alone looked impossible. Vaccines had to survive tropical heat with no reliable refrigeration. Health workers had to reach villages with no roads, and sometimes no maps. None of that stopped the campaign. The method that finally worked was not simply vaccinating everyone on Earth. It was something far more surgical, called ring vaccination. Find a case, vaccinate everyone that person had been in contact with, and everyone around them, building a wall of immunity the virus could not cross, so the disease ran out of new bodies to infect before it ever found them. Teams of vaccinators walked into some of the most remote places on the planet, sometimes tracking a single rumor of a rash for days, across terrain with no roads at all, in a campaign that demanded over a decade of sustained cooperation between countries that, in nearly every other respect, were locked in Cold War hostility toward one another. American and Soviet health officials, representing governments that could not agree on almost anything else, worked the same outbreak maps side by side, because the virus did not check which side of the Iron Curtain it was about to kill someone on. The last person on Earth to contract naturally occurring smallpox was a hospital cook in Somalia named Ali Mao Maaleen, diagnosed in October of 1977. He survived. In May of 1980, the World Health Organization formally declared smallpox eradicated, the first and, to this day, the only human disease ever completely wiped from nature through deliberate, coordinated human effort. A virus that had shaped the rise and fall of empires for at least 3,000 years, that had killed more people in the 20th century alone than every war of that century combined, simply stopped existing in the wild because enough people in enough countries decided, together, that it would. Which brings us back to those two freezers, one in Atlanta, one in a closed Russian city most people could not find on a map. Behind blast doors, under armed guard, sit the only known remaining samples of a virus that once decided who sat on the throne of Spain, who ruled the Aztec Empire, who governed the Inca, and who lived long enough to grow old in a Georgian cottage in England. Routine vaccination against it ended decades ago across most of the world for the simplest possible reason. The thing it protects against no longer exists anywhere a person could actually catch it. An entire category of human vulnerability, one that had quietly decided the fate of pharaohs, emperors, and kings for 4,000 years, was closed for good within a single human lifetime by people in lab coats and field boots who refused to let it keep winning. The next time you come across an old portrait of a European monarch, take a closer look at the skin. Unusually smooth, and you're looking at someone who survived. Pitted and scarred, and you are looking at someone who very nearly did not. Either way, you are looking at a small, accidental record of one of the most powerful forces that has ever existed. A thing too small to see that decided more wars of succession, ended more dynasties, and reshaped more borders than any general who ever lived, and that finally lost, for good, to a milkmaid's blister and a few 100,000 people who refused to stop. If you want to see how this same pattern played out again, with a different disease, a different century, and a death toll that very nearly matches this one, the next story is already waiting on your screen. Subscribe to Patient Zero, and I will see you there.